Yes.
So when you hear the word change, what comes to mind?
That there will have to be adjustments made, and wondering whether they're going to be good or whether they're going to be negative.
Or do any emotions come to mind when you think of the word change?
Stress.
Okay. Why do you feel that way about the word change? Like, what's your background?
Just in a work environment, having to deal with lots of change. So I think that even generational differences, those kind of changes, I've had to deal a lot with that, and it can be frustrating at times. So, but it can be positive at times too. So I don't want to be
Kind of the
totally
unknown.
negative. Yeah, it's unknown, so a little bit of stress about, I wonder how difficult this is going to be to get through.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there. This is my reaction to the first interview that I completed. That was with my mom. Her background is in HR management, and so it was interesting for me to hear her take on change because she knew more than maybe some lower level, even lower level managers or staff members. So for her, change was, well, how does this involve me, and at what level of the company do I need to implement this change? It also makes sense that she brought up the differences in generations, and how that can kind of bring a little bit of confusion and having to work around the way people understand things and how she can communicate the change with them. She did use some negative terms that I thought were interesting, like frustrating and stressed. And it appeared that there was some anxiety with, is this change going to be good or bad? Kind of leading me to believe that maybe her idea of change is she doesn't have a say in the change, that she kind of got it afterward, and she was required to implement it. It also seemed to me that there was a lack of appreciation for the early implementation dip. And I found that kind of interesting. And I'd love to know why that brings her a little bit of anxiety. Maybe it's because once the change is made, she was just required to run with it and given no direction. Not sure.
Hi there. This week we are learning about change, and I wanted to ask you what you think of when you hear the word change.
Chaos and resistance.
Okay, and why is that?
Because people typically tend to be resistant to change if it's not clearly explained to them. And as a result, it causes chaos in the environment that's being applied.
Sure.
If it's work, if it's just general life, if it's a religious body, times people leave, people come, it's always change, and it's causing difficulties for people who are used to the status quo.
Sure. And what ways you had mentioned that people aren't prepared for the change from leadership. In what ways do you think leadership can help better prepare their employees for change?
To explain why change is being made clearly, not just because I'm a leader and you're not and we're going to change. If you can tell me why things are going to be different, hopefully better as a result of the change,
You get better buy-in.
you get better buy-in, obviously, and you'll get support from the rank and file. And that's very important, because regardless of how good the change is, if you don't get support from the ground up, you're going nowhere.
Yeah, you're going to fail. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that pretty much says it all.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So the second interview I did was with Jim. He's my stepdad. He has background in accounting, leadership type roles for Shopko many, many years ago, when they were over in Ashwaubenon, Wisconsin. I found it interesting that the terms he used were negative. First of all, chaos and resistance, and it being not clearly explained to them, and that's why we enter a little bit of resistance. I also found it interesting when I asked him to explain how leadership can better manage change, how he said that better clarity would lead to less resistance, instead of, asking for his employees' input to make the change. How should we make the change? What can we implement to make the change? Asking for their input was not expressed. And I think that's very typical for that generation. I think that's just kind of the way things were. You know, leadership, the Good Boys Club made the decision, and then they were supposed to, you know, communicate that downward, where in today's time, it is more likely, from the discussions at least, the discussion posts that I saw, that leadership would ask for input from their employees to get better buy-in instead of just communicating better.
How do I feel about change? Change can be exciting, but most often it's kind of scary. Mostly because it's the unknown. The thing that I get the most hung up on is if there's something that's being changed that I put into place or work hard on most of the time, and it's being changed and talked about without me being part of it, I start getting a little upset. Like, you know, my baby is being adjusted or, you know, moved without me being involved on it. But yeah, change can be exciting because improvements, you know, change can be improvement, but it's just the unknown of if the improvement's actually going to work or not. That can be scary.
The next interview I performed was with my brother Jeremy. His background is in warehouse management. He worked for WGNR as a warehouse manager for several years. Had an issue with with one of his leadership team members and ended up leaving the company. I thought it was interesting that his take on change, because he did implement a lot of change and tried to implement some better ways of doing things with his company. I found it interesting that he said that change is unknown. And so there's a little bit of anxiety with that. He said it's exciting and scary. So he used both positive and negative terms, which tracks for somebody in a leadership position. It sounded like birth to death change was really important to him. You know, if he starts change, then he wants to see it through to the end, but that's just not feasible in a large company like WGNR. And maybe that's part of the reason that his employment didn't work there in the first place. His leadership style and change style was affiliative. He always put his people first. I remember him talking to me all the time about how he would have to stay longer hours because one of his employees had some sort of family emergency they had to go to, or somebody had a doctor's appointment and had to leave. And so I thought it was really interesting that, you know, he put so much of himself into his job, and his people always came first. He did seem to touch a little bit on the fact that change is pretty complex. And I know we read about that in our text, that it's always complex. There's never a linear path for change. It has to change, you know, with the cycle.
I'm definitely not someone that likes change. I crave consistency. When things do change, I tend to get anxious or uneasy, sometimes even get into a negative headspace that I'm immediately against that change. If I had to pick a reason as to why, I could always blame it on my parents getting divorced when I was young, and everything consistent in my life just got upheaved, and between schedules and just any consistent practices that I was used to for the first, you know, few years of my life just completely changed, and probably just really craved that consistency. So
the last interview I had was with my sister-in-law, Melissa. She is on the payroll department, and she completed her college education with major in actuary, which my mom had to explain to me this week, and I had no idea what it was. So she's a very linear thinking person. She likes black and white. She doesn't like any gray area. Leadership is not really the role for her. She would rather have her own duties, that and her own set of rules that she's responsible for. And so I can see how change would be really, really scary for her and really anxiety driven. It did seem like a lot of her reaction was personal and less professional. And I can also understand that, and I can relate with that because the same happened with my parents. I just wonder what type of leadership style she's been exposed to with regard to change, and, you know, if she had a more open management that asked for her, input on change if she maybe would view it differently. But yeah, she's very linear thinking, so it makes sense that the complexities of change would be anxiety ridden to her. And this is the final video. I loved this experience. I thought it was really interesting to see how different people reacted to change. All of my knowledge about change thus far has come from our book from class, Leading in a Culture of Change. I'm not really sure how to cite this on video. This one is the first edition, written by Michael Fullen. The publisher is Jossie Bass, a Wiley imprint. And these were from chapters 1 through 3. So yeah, thanks.